Rosie taught all her children that there was a Santa Claus, that there was most definitely an Easter Bunny that hid decorated eggs from children, and that she kept in command of certain scary, horrible, best not to ask, hobgoblins in various dark nooks and crannies. She always kept an internal ready dossier on every person in the family and all neighbors, distant though they typically were, so she knew which hot buttons to manipulate during conversations with them. Steve grew to understand that his mother was full of a certain kind of wicked creativity. She could synthesize a story from nothing, which on the surface seemed at least plausible. The only problem is, albeit slow, selective memory caused her to forget enough that she automatically filled in the gaps in her memory with multiple versions of synthesized reality. Family and friends could tell she was in her storytelling mode and would adjust their listening mode to her accordingly. At least most of these behaviors directly followed the historical struggles of autistic mothers throughout history. It was difficult for Steve to see any rhyme or reason to her ways until he grew old and awake enough to benefit from the wisdom of autistic lore. When Steve grew older, he remembered these people, autism researchers, scribbling in notebooks while watching him and his younger brother. He remembered bosses of his father that he discovered much later were actually lead researchers into the cause of and treatments for autism. Chapter 13. Stilson Ranch. Joe became homesick. He missed Colorado, American food, and most of all, he missed his friends and family back in Colorado. He became depressed, and nothing Rosie said or did would break his dark mood. After a couple of months of this grim new development, Rosie agreed to move back to Colorado. Joe immediately perked up and quickly gave notice of his departure to the ranch. Within 2 weeks, they were back in the loaded-down sky blue Ford pickup heading south. They reached the high plains in 4 days. Within a few days, Joe had a new job on the Stilson Ranch, only 7 miles from Kim. The whole family quickly fell in love with this new ranch, a place Joe knew of but had never worked for before. Steve turned 8 years old that summer. Rosie was happy with their new digs. Steve climbed the 15 feet to the top of the haystack that stretched 100 yards north and south, on the western edge of the Stilson Ranch's central hub. He loved to be up high, where he could survey everything with a sweeping gaze. It was a late autumn afternoon. The westering sun cast orange shadows from the white buildings with dark red trim. He looked east over the acres of corrals and long roof of the low calving shed to the house where he lived with his family. It was a point of anchoring for him in the ocean of yellow grass that rolled away in every direction to the horizon, many miles away. He peered into the shop, located to the left of the house, hoping to see someone working with machinery, but it was dark and silent, as the whole ranch seemed to be at that point. He panned right and looked for activity at the ranch's tiny airport. At least that's what he called it. His mother simply referred to the 3 hangars and dirt runway on the south side as the hangars. Nothing moved there. He looked south at the rows of silver galvanized grain silos standing huge and silent in the orange magnificence of the setting sun. As far as Steve could tell, he was alone on the ranch with his mother and little brother. He thought about being alone atop a haystack on an open expanse of prairie, without even a tree to break the monotony. He felt the feeling he was well accustomed to having throughout his 9 years, a most normal feeling, alone. He was completely alone. There was no one like himself to share his thoughts with, to talk to, or play with. He turned and sat cross-legged, facing the sun. The sun was hanging just above the west edge of the world. Tears filled his eyes as he stared into the bright orange center of the sun. The brightness hurt his eyes, but he forced himself to stare, unblinking, into the burning core for 30 seconds. He was no longer alone, a small child shivering on a haystack. He flew away to the center of the sun and escaped the gnawing, constant emotional pain that gripped him. Finally, alarms intruded on his dissociation, and he quickly looked away. For several minutes he was blind, unable to see even his hand in front of his face. The retinal damage continued with him as floaters for years. One Sunday afternoon, Steve heard a strange hammering, plinking sound coming from the ranch's small, all-purpose shop. Curious, he walked into the greasy, smelly, dark shop, careful to step around the gaping rectangular grease pit in the middle of the single-car garage come wood, leather, and metal shop. He looked up to see his father standing with a hammer and stone chisel, a large block of gray sandstone sitting on the ancient-looking workbench in front of him. "Hey, Dad, what's that?" Steve asked. Joe lowered his arms and turned slowly towards his oldest son. "I'm making a tombstone for your grandpa." Steve thought this over for a while, then asked, "Didn't he die a long time ago?" "Yes, when I was younger than you are now," Joe replied quietly. "And Grandpa's grave doesn't have a tombstone?" Steve asked with surprise. "Nope," was all his old daddy said. "I always thought the gravestones were made by funeral homes," Steve persisted. "Yeah, not exactly, but sure, most people don't make them by themselves. It is quite a bit of trouble, I'm finding. This may take a few Sundays. It took me a whole day just to get the block fairly square." "Why don't you just buy one from a funeral home?" Steve offered helpfully. Joe frowned and replied, "They are quite expensive. We don't have that kind of money to waste on this." "Oh," said Steve. "I'm kind of busy right now. Why don't you go play with your teddy bear?" Joe quipped as he returned to chiseling out each letter and number of the simple epitaph. Steve scowled and yelled, "I'm too big for a stuffed bear. I don't even remember ever playing with a teddy bear. I don't know why you're always saying that." Then he ran out of the shop, angry and resentful. Joe wasn't wearing any eye protection, as always, and he paid the price with a sharp splinter of the chisel's steel lodged in one of his eyes. Despite her best efforts to get her husband to let her drive him to the doctor in La Junta, 60 miles away, he characteristically flatly refused. She was finally able to extract the microscopic shard with a strong permanent magnet. Joe's vision was affected for a few months. Joe took both his sons with him several Sundays later to place the tombstone he had carved at his father's gravesite, southwest of Villagreen. Joe had a hard time locating his father's grave. It was hard to find, as the tiny tin plaque had gotten misplaced in the intervening 35 years. Joe dug around in the thin, sandy dirt for an hour, finally finding the tiny tag, which he hoped was still located above the correct, slight, now anonymous mound in the middle of unkempt tumbleweeds and grama grass. He lugged the stone to that spot and dropped it on top of the tin tag. He walked back to the old pickup and brought out his 1924 Bakelite plastic Valiant 620 black and white film camera. He took 2 pictures of the stone in the cold sunlight, and the 3 trudged back to drive away in silence, never to return to the grave. The tombstone project seemed to wake up the artist in Joe. Years before, under Helena's influence, Joe began to take an interest in fine art. He had always doodled figures and Western scenes on cardboard, children's tablet paper, and the backs of envelopes. When he was in the Navy, he drew soft porn line drawings and adult cartoons that were often published in the ship's weekly newspaper. Helena saw his obvious talent, so she helped him get a small easel, real canvases, and his first oil paints in 1949. Joe sent away to an art correspondence course Helena had found an ad for in a magazine. When he became sober, through sheer strength of will, he would turn to painting in the evenings and on his Sundays off. This became his outlet, especially in the cold winter time, to vent his nervous energy and need to create art with some kind of meaning. He quickly became proficient, but unable to speak much about it in conversation, even with Helena. On Sundays, his one day off each week, he quietly produced a series of oil paintings of the Western primitive ranch style. He tried most mediums, including oils, watercolors, pastels, and charcoal. His artwork became a local legend of sorts. Many people tried to buy paintings from Joe. He always became flustered and embarrassed when people not only praised his art, but also offered him more than his month's salary to obtain some of his pieces. He would become angry and then insist on giving the paintings to people who wanted them. His large oil paintings of old-time Western scenes were the most popular. and although he could have become a very successful artist, his autism kept him stuck firmly in the cowboy rut. Anytime anyone showed too much interest, he would stop painting and declare that he was done with such foolishness. That is when he branched out and exceeded expectations in wood carving, often crafting such amazing handmade rifle stocks that they too became sought after. Like all new things he learned about, Joe lost interest immediately after mastering graphic arts. Though he had not completed high school, Joe's mind was always thirsty to learn something new, just for the joy he felt in simply learning, but only within the close confines of particular subjects. Statistical data especially signified. While they were living in Williams Lake, Rosie bought a nice Pentax Japanese single-lens reflex camera. Joe made snide comments about it. Those slant-eyed so-and-sos and their cheap pot metal crap. His opinion became a bit more positive when he saw the quality of the first snapshots developed from the color 35mm film. He had always used his old Bakelite plastic 620 black and white format camera that required full daylight to use up to that time. It was a simple fixed focus camera that required no use of a light meter and complex camera configuration settings that the SLR camera required. Joe liked the results of the Japanese camera, but because it was complex, and also because it was made by the Japanese, he left it to Rosie and continued to use his old beat-up plastic one from a bygone age. Steve shook his head in befuddlement. In 1969, the Gandhis became good friends with the Barnes family. Joe grew up around this family, but had only ever been regular friends with the old man, Philo Barnes. Francine helped her husband Philo build and operate their tiny Villa Green outpost about 20 miles west of the town of Kim, Colorado, starting in about 1933. Her son Paulo ran around the little lone store with the one primitive gas pump. Fast forward 9 years, and Paulo, like Joe, was serving in the military during World War II. When Paulo came back from fighting in World War II, he spent a few weeks in New York City. It was there that he met Norma, a pretty young Italian-American girl who was raised in Brooklyn. In a whirlwind of a stormy romance, they became entwined and then quickly married. She tried to get him to acclimate to New York and stay there with her family. Paulo had a high intelligence and an iron will. He moved her back to his family on the high plains. To her, it seemed like she had been transported to the surface of the moon. A depression as firm and confining as a straitjacket enclosed her as she failed again and again to accept the lonesome, wide-open nothingness of Villa Green. She quickly gained enormous weight. Norma brought some East Coast culture to that little town on the high plains prairie. There were a number of fugitives scattered in hiding over the bare highland. A strange, actual Mr. Bean also lived there with his rumored second sight, and who built a large reclusive family while marching to his own drummer. There was Old Man Lefty, who hid out in the red sandstone canyons longer than anyone, building his own private Western museum after finally coming out of hiding. Locals fawned under the 6'11" tall friendly gaze from twin giants, Billy and Adam Luther, and a cast of characters numerous, anonymous, and unique developed from settler families. Together, spread thinly in the least populated county of Colorado, they formed an edgy community. Since there was no permanent law enforcement nor enough taxes to pay for such, beyond policing the larger towns of La Junta, Springfield, and Lamar, a few ranchers took it upon themselves to get the county sheriffs to deputize them. Dudley Huckloat was one of those deputies. He was the one who finally talked old Lefty into turning himself in. He did not at first trust Lefty, as he suspected he had stolen a number of low-value items from local ranchers, including some baling wire from him, while Lefty had hidden out in the canyons for over 28 years. But Dudley thought that perhaps the statute of limitations were up for his accidental killing of a friend in Missouri. After he brought Lefty into La Junta to face arrest, Dudley gave the sheriff a statement of his own, supporting Lefty as a person of good character and great personal courage and strength, who had helped several people in the high plains during the hard years of the Great Depression. Lefty had helped many people, even while hiding out around them. Lefty was held for a couple of weeks in the Pueblo jail, waiting for extradition back to Missouri. But Missouri dismissed the case, being as nearly 30 years had passed. When the sheriff informed him, Dudley traveled the 120 miles to Pueblo and drove old Lefty back to his ramshackle cabin near the rim rocks of Chilcoot Canyon. Life began anew for Lefty, who, being nearly 60 years old, felt he had been given a second chance. He decided that he had been called as a curator of all that he had silently observed of the history on the high plain. Within 10 years, he had built up a peculiar cattle ranch around his cabin and begun to gather old wagons, old firearms, and old Native American relics he had spied over the years. His fences were famous for their meticulous construction and longevity. Each fence post stood no more than 1 foot from the other, and all were woven with at least 8 strands of barbed wire. The local ranchers and farmers were enthusiastic about a heritage museum and bandaged together to help him afford a small plot in Kim, where he spent the next 20 years building his one-of-a-kind Western Museum. It was never open to the public, only made available for local people who he personally knew. Joe greatly admired old Lefty and was often allowed to peruse the relics collected into the museum. When his son Steve was 8 years old, he took him and his little brother to see it. From the outside, it looked like some kind of junkyard, with no signage or other markings to give away its secret. Joe knocked hard a few minutes on the boarded-up gate. Old Lefty, now in his mid-90s, met the three with an antique revolver in his hands as he cracked open the boarded paneled gate of the concealed lot's driveway. When he saw it was Joe, he shoved the 6-shooter in his thigh holster and smiled a mostly toothless grin.
"Get in here, Joe. It's about time you brought your young'uns to get some real education. I got some new shit to show you."
Old Lefty cackled as he chained the gate closed behind them. The old man had stashed artifacts all over the grounds: covered wagons, Winchester repeater rifles, antique bows and arrows, Native American headdresses, a large collection of dowsing rods, lots of saddles, tack, and a barrel full of old kitchen appliances.